Okay, it's 4:15 and I think we should start with our today's seminar. I'd like to welcome you to our seminar series, A Small, Beautiful and Large Awful, Farm Sizes and Sustainability in Agriculture. This is the third lecture that we organized in this winter semester, and my name is Gesa Busch, and I organized this lecture series together with Professor Achim Spiller, who is also joining us here, and you can see him. Today's lecture will be in English, so we have some lectures that are in German language, but today there will be a talk in English. For today's lecture, I am very happy that we were able to attract Robert Finger. And I will introduce you shortly to our audience, but before we start, I would like to give some hints on the organizational things of this webinar. So you in the audience can ask questions in two forms. You can either raise your hand using the raise your hand button, and then our colleague Denise Rada will unmute you so that you are able to ask your question yourself. Or if you prefer, you could also use the F&A section, so the question and answer section that you see below the pictures, and you can write your questions there, and then we will pick them up and hopefully answer them according to what you expect. So, as I said, today, Professor Dr. Robert Finger will give a talk. Professor Finger is Professor of Agriculture, Economics and Policy at the ETH Zürich in Switzerland. His research is based on the interface of agriculture science and economics in the area of resilient and sustainable agriculture and food systems. His focus in research is on farm level decisions and interrelation with the environment, market, societies and policy. So I think he's really a good expert to tell us today more about the transition towards low pesticide production systems in Switzerland, and this is the talk that we have scheduled for today. Before I hand over to you, Professor Finger, I will also mention that you are very active in science communication, and I really recommend his blog on agricultural policy. For those of you who don't know this blog, I highly recommend taking a look at this. But with this, I will hand over to you, and we are really looking forward to your presentation.
So I hope you can see my slides now. Is this working?
We can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And big thanks for that very nice introduction and the invitation. So it's always a pleasure to be in Göttingen, whether virtually or in person. I really look forward to that exchange here, but also afterwards based on that or other topics. So thank you very much for inviting me. The topic of my talk is going to be pesticides and reduction of pesticide use, transition into low or no pesticide production systems. And this is not one paper that I'm going to present, but rather like a summary of a couple of activities we have here. And this is done, of course, with many co-authors together, and just wanted to highlight three here: Niklas Möhring, Chloe McCallum, and Luca Zachman. In my talk, I would like to address a couple of points. Well, first, I want to give a bit general introduction of the problem or the motivation, tap on some kind of solutions for better pesticide policies, because I also want to meet a bit the overall topic of the seminar series. I want to talk about the relationship between farm size and pesticide use, but then spend some time on really going into detail of two case studies where this transitioning into low or no pesticide production systems is taking place in Switzerland. Because there are different elements and blocks, I have kind of like some breakpoints for questions in between. So you may want to make use of it, and we can start with kind of like questions of clarification here, even in between, but also, of course, we can do that at the very end. So Well, that's not the direction I wanted to go. This is the direction I want to go. So to start with, plant protection is crucial. It's very clear that pest management is a key element for food security and many other ecosystem services that the agricultural sector is providing. And also achievements both in chemical and non-chemical plant protection that have been made in the last decades or century are, of course, a core element of our society where we are at the moment. We also know that, of course, without proper pest management, the quantity and quality of crop production would be at substantially lower levels. And this is nothing that is going to disappear in the future, but in contrast, it's probably gaining in importance, plant protection, because obviously we have an increasing demand for agriculture products and also the other ecosystem services provided by the agriculture sector, but also the demand for high quality food, of course, is not declining, but increasing overall. And there are aspects like climate change putting additional pressure on the agriculture sector, for example, because the disease pressure is increasing, as that paper here by Deutsch and Corvus in Science nicely laid out. So, for example, new diseases are emerging in Switzerland as an entry door from Southern Europe is actually experiencing that every year, because there's a new invasive species actually harming the fruit and wine production in Switzerland. But on the other hand, of course, we know that pesticides, especially as one core element of plant protection strategies, are harmful for the environment and human health. And I really highly recommend that paper by Fiona Tang and co-authors published in Nature Geoscience that basically is that map to the top right here. This is a pesticide risk assessment on a global level and clearly shows that among other regions, Europe is a global hotspot of pesticide risk. And for the reason that human health and the environment are affected by pesticides, risk reduction from pesticide use is an explicit goal in many countries. And of course, almost all European countries have these national action plans. The farm to fork strategy is very clear also on very clear, but there is an element to reduce pesticide use and risk till 2030 by 50%. But it's also very clear that many of the goals that are articulated are not reached or not yet reached, to frame it positive. So we still, what we can measure, we usually see that there are thresholds that are legally set, not met. So for example, that water bodies are regularly and widespread polluted. And also, I guess, even more critical, many things we simply don't know because we don't have the data. And this is the bottom right paper. This was a comment in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, where we basically highlighted the need for better pesticide use data, not only at national level sales data, but really at the level of the farm to understand what is ongoing and where the state is. So here I would say many things are ambitious goals, but many things are still, well, not perfectly solved. And this, of course, that entire question of pesticide and pesticide use is not only a scientific debate, but it's obviously a societal and policy debate. And this is a very critical debate, and especially in Switzerland, it actually took a bit a different direction than it would take in other countries. Namely, Switzerland voted a couple of months ago whether Switzerland should be entirely pesticide-free. To make it short, it won't be because these votes were rejected. But this is an important point because in Switzerland you have the instrument of popular initiatives, and with 100,000 signatures, you can basically put something up on vote to change the constitution, and here there were two popular initiatives basically trying to make much tougher policies regarding pesticides. And I will say a couple of words to that in a second. Where this was coming from was very clear that many goals in the field of pesticide pollution were not met. This is not only a European thing, but Switzerland is here no exception, and probably even in contrast. So there were a lot of debates about drinking water being polluted, and most of the small water bodies in Switzerland are more or less kind of exceeding the legal thresholds. And there were also studies here by the SCNAT, the Academy of Natural Science, basically showing that there is a burden of 500-600 million Swiss francs as external costs from pesticide use in Switzerland. So all that contributed to that debate. And there were these two popular initiatives. One was called the Pesticide Initiative, and the other one the Drinking Water Initiative. And Pesticide Initiative is simple because it basically said, okay, we want to ban all synthetic pesticides, not only from agriculture, but from all Switzerland. So no home gardening with glyphosate. And also in the food sector, there would have been adjustments. Plus, the initiative proposed that Switzerland is only allowed to import food that is produced without pesticides. And this was the first popular initiative. And the second one took a bit a different approach. Namely, here, the Drinking Water Initiative proposed that the getting direct payments should be based on tougher cross-compliance regulations. And tougher here means not using pesticides, but also you see that here in the title, fewer antibiotics to be used, fewer fodder imports, and so on. But here the idea would have been, okay, farmers have the option to do what they do now, but then they don't receive direct payments, or they switch into pesticide-free production systems in order to maintain with direct payments. Of course, direct payments have a different magnitude in Switzerland. So for many farms, that would have been the only economic viable choice to not use pesticides. Both of these initiatives were rejected, but you can also frame that differently, that 40% of the Swiss population basically voted for pesticide-free production systems. Usually these debates are not so, I mean, they are emotional, but ultimately the votes are based on clear arguments. And the rejection is also in line with what the Swiss government proposed to do. And the Swiss government basically had a couple of arguments why these popular initiatives should be rejected. First of all, domestic production would be reduced. That means more imports, and more imports means also a leakage of environmental footprints to other countries. And I think this is a key element for also societal debates. We can't improve our environmental performance domestically if we just harm others. So maintaining the production levels where they are with a lower environmental footprint is, I guess, key. Then, of course, there were discussions on farmers' income, because not using pesticides means more costs, sometimes lower revenues, and ultimately also likely higher consumer prices. And then I said that with the trade component, so that, of course, also raised some points with respect to existing trade agreements. But what happened, these popular initiatives were around for 4 or respectively 5 years, and there was a lot of discussion, and that actually triggered a lot of adjustment processes in the agriculture sector. So all farming schools do experiments on low and no pesticide practices now. Policies set much more ambitious targets, and I come back to that later on, the industry made bold moves. So the industry, meaning the retail sector, for example, also put in some proposals to basically show that we are doing something. So this was an important element here. And overall, how to maneuver in that area of pesticide policies is probably something that deserves a bigger picture than just like trying to tell farmers what to do or not to do. Last year, we published a paper in Nature Food where we brought together experts from various fields and tried to sketch a bit like what could be the entry point. And one key message is, okay, It's probably a good pesticide policy is not only starting at the level of the farm, but it's also including the up and downstream components. And I think there are a couple of points to mention here. I'm just making that quick. But of course, if you want to reduce pesticide use and still have the same production, then you also need alternatives, and these alternatives might be also coming from new breeding technologies. We just talked about that a couple of minutes before that presentation here, or also aspects like precision farming, but also, of course, it's not only technology, but also the farming systems need to be adjusted and need to be there and ready to be used. But you also need tangible instruments to incentivize farmers. And I think as economists, we often believe also that economic instruments like taxes or subsidies may play a role here. And ultimately, I said that the downstream sector is key, and I will come back to that again and again. But if there is no viable market for the products that you produce under new low pesticide regimes, whether with new technologies or farming systems, if nobody buys that and nobody pays a value like additional price markup, it's probably very difficult to bring that into life. So maybe here is one breakpoint for questions. If there are some, I'm happy to jump in, but I'm also happy to proceed. So I have more slides, no worries.
So if there are questions, please raise your hand or write it in the F&A section. Achim has a question.
Maybe a short one. You mentioned that there's a division between rural areas and urban areas. Is it a strong division? Is it more or less a rural-urban topic, or what is the reason for this? Because in Germany we cannot measure different attitudes towards pesticides between rural and urban areas. We try to, but do not find differences.
Yeah, this is a good question. I believe now after these initiatives, there's a lot of research going on. I know some political scientists are digging deeper into the topic now. But the observation was that all the big cities, which in Switzerland means, bigger villages starting from 50,000 inhabitants, all were in favor of these initiatives, and all the other areas, whether they are urban or rural, rejected those initiatives. Good point. I think also the voting behavior is more green in cities. Maybe people also, in Zurich, people are richer. Maybe they can also afford more expensive food, so this is less of an issue. But overall, of course, Switzerland is very determined by agricultural sector. This is very important also in the policy process. So in the rural areas, all popular initiatives, independent of what you propose there, will fail likely if they want to have stricter rules for the agricultural sector. So this is not to be underestimated. That's a core element of the policy process there. So
yeah, thank you very much.
We have another question in the Q&A section from Katharina Heil, and she writes, I was wondering if there are any pesticide-related policy objectives, for example, to sustainably use or reduce pesticide usage in Switzerland, maybe comparable to the goals of the Farm to Fork strategy.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you very much. I haven't been explicit about that. No, that's indeed the case. So Switzerland also has a national action plan on pesticides that came after the EU did it. So basically the EU was the role model here. And then in that process now of the popular initiatives, there was, I don't know how to exactly frame that, but it's called a parliamentarian initiative kicked off, where an ambitious target was formulated. So reducing pesticide risk in Switzerland by 50% till 2027, but I'm not so sure how the risk is measured, and maybe all the involved persons as well not. But there should be something done substantially in the next years. The problem is a bit, formulating goals is often very nice, and but meeting them is more painful. So But there are as ambitious targets as in the Farm to Fork. Yeah. But I would say Switzerland is by definition now on track on moving to these targets quickly, because there is still a lot of societal pressure on that. Then maybe I proceed. Is this?
Yes, please.
Perfect. So I said that we are talking about a small, beautiful, and with respect to pesticides, I'm not so sure. This is so context specific whether small farms are better or worse here. So it's really, really difficult. But screening a bit at literature in that like division of small to large farms and pesticide use. Apparently, in China, there's quite some literature on that, and their larger farms use less pesticides. Maybe this is also related to meeting some goals with existing resources and goals in terms of income and production. Also, of course, in contexts where professional equipment and use of pesticides might be not always given, then larger farms might be more professional in handling pesticides. So this was also something that is there, but I'm not so sure whether for Europe that really holds. I think like low pesticide production and organic is going hand in hand, even though organic also uses pesticides that are also critical, of course, but also here relationship is very ambiguous. What I find interesting is all these landscape approaches to also reduce pest pressure and with that also have an impact. And there's really cool papers by Ashley Larson and co-authors like, no, I'm not so sure, Nowak from Vancouver, that use Californian data, and they basically show well, smaller structures are very beneficial here, and that's also likely associated with smaller farms, but obviously not always true. And then something we talked about, technologies to be used, and that's of course something where larger farms are more likely to take, for example, precision farming tools than smaller farms. So with that efficiency gain might be rather there at larger farms, but also here probably it just needs different forms of collaborating and across farms and bringing technologies into the sector. And overall, like reflecting on farm size and pesticide use, so I have to say all Swiss farms are small by definition in a bigger context, right? With an average farm size of 20 hectares. And so if Swiss farms can make a transition into low and no pesticide practices, then of course other small farms might also, but again, very context dependent. But we, in our case studies, don't see clear patterns. And I want to present now two of these case studies. So basically this was the big picture with the pathways to pesticide policies, but we also have to make that tangible. So our research is not only on the surface, but we really want to go in and really work with case studies and see what is possible. And of course, our role as agriculture economists is not to provide new solutions to farmers. I mean, there are many solutions around, but we are rather interested how different solutions are taken up or not taken up, and what role markets but also policies can play here. So this is pretty much at that in that representation really something where we see a link between farmers but also food industry. Even sometimes the input suppliers are included till the consumers. And I have two case studies, one on wine and one on wheat, that I would like to talk about in more detail. The first one is like Switzerland is going to face a transition with large share of the area under wheat going to be pesticide-free but not organic in a couple of years. This is because the system could build up on an existing low pesticide use scheme, and the biggest retailer, Migros, decided to sell only pesticide-free products, bread, starting from 2023. So either organic or pesticide-free, non-organic. And this is a viable area that is created here between conventional production and organic. but pesticide-free. So the initial situation, I said that in Switzerland, there's a reduced pesticide scheme. It's called Extenso. That's sold under, like, IP Swiss is the label and the producer association. So these ladybugs you see in many shops in Switzerland. So this is the vast majority of, or the majority of bread wheat is produced under the scheme already. And this is interesting because it's there since 30 years. So it's a production scheme where in wheat production, you only can use herbicides and seed treatments, no growth regulators, no fungicides, which is important. And this is basically so well established that also, the breeding actually goes in the direction of having resistant varieties. Farmers receive a price markup. They receive additional direct payments for that. You see that here a bit in numbers. You also see, of course, that wheat prices and profit margins are at a different level than in other neighboring countries. But basically, it also flags it does pay for the farmers to make the transition. And this is, I guess, very important. And there's a lot of support around that. The next step is to go pesticide-free. This means from that existing scheme, you also take away herbicides and seed treatments. And this is, there's nothing only for wheat. This is the important thing. There are no implications for other crops in the crop rotation. It's also not organic because you can still use artificial fertilizer, and pesticide use is basically substituted away here using different varieties. Mechanical weed control, but it's not plowing everything. So it's still, I guess, safe to assume that this is not going back to very old times in a particular crop rotation. So in Switzerland, you anyway have much wider crop rotations, and it's also something like wheat after wheat is simply not done. So this is an important component here. And I said that the largest retailer decided to sell only pesticide-free bread. And this is then big because if they make that move, then somebody has to produce what they want to sell. And this is going to be in 2 years. So the plan, I'm not sure whether this is met, 20% of the Swiss wheat market. And you see here where this is at about 6%, but it's on its way, as also this article to the bottom right indicates. And again, farmers get an additional price markup and they get additional direct payments to not use herbicides here. So this is a combination between direct payments and price markups paid by the market and ultimately then transferred to the consumer. That is relevant. In our research in that case study, and I said that we also want to be tangible in what we do and get our hands dirty at the case studies, was actually twofold. First of all, before that scheme was actually initiated, we had ex-ante assessment of that scheme using a bioeconomic model to basically also support this decision made by the retailer and the farmer association. And then we have been involved in an ex-post assessment where we investigate the first uptake decisions at going live in the market. And I'm basically going to talk about that. And we did a survey with all these eligible producers from IP Swiss. I have about 1,100 responses, and we combine these survey data with a lot of structural information, and I guess particularly important here because it's especially now a step to remove herbicide use. All this question of weed and weed management is key. So we added a lot of information on weed pressure, especially explicit, but also resistances and so on. What we did in that survey, we had quite some time invested in developing hypotheses and doing interviews and pretest. Went to a couple of farms and we asked farmers about their adoption of that program. So we basically did that at the early 2020, and the farmers could decide in the end of 2019 to go into that scheme the first time, like freely. So this was the first season, so to say. We asked many things, also whether they plan to make that adoption decision. This is also important. And asked detailedly about the strategies that they would use, but also in a lot of detail about their expectations in terms of yield failure, risk, and so on, and risk coming from different sources, market, production, the direct payments that disappear. And then we had a lot of also characteristics of the farmers being collected here. So what we see is that in that first year, 14% of the eligible producers under the IP Swiss scheme were already moving into that pesticide-free production. 44, and this is important, intend to adopt. We don't see patterns in that sense over Switzerland, but with respect to spatial allocation. But so this is flagging a big potential for that program. And then, I mean, we are currently working on a couple of papers using that data set, but we also want to extend the data set and create a panel data set. So what I'm presenting is econometrically not overwhelmingly sophisticated, but we had a paper in food policy basically describing a bit the scheme and exploring the first descriptive insights. And interestingly, farm size doesn't matter. And that was actually interesting because also if the farmers adopt that program, then they have to adopt all their wheat into that program and not only specific parcels. So actually the producer organization was first thinking that larger farms might not go into that, but larger farms again might be easier to switch into mechanical weeding equipment and so on. We also found no other structural characteristics really to matter. What mattered is, of course, economic incentives. So farmers are very much looking to price premiums and even more than to direct payments as an incentive scheme. And we also saw that expectations and risk matters a lot. So for example, we find that the more risk tolerant farmers or less risk averse are more likely to adopt. And also there was a substantial heterogeneity in the perception of yield risk and investment risk. And that of course also has a negative effect and on the adoption decision. And there were really large differences also in the expectation of the program, how much the additional costs are, how much the yield losses are. And this is something where now also extension, of course, has entry points to fill some gaps that might be there. What is interesting that it was so clear is if farmers perceive that not using pesticides is doing good for the environment, they are much more likely to adopt that program. And that's not reverse causality, because we also looked at that link to, let's say, the plant uptake behavior. So this is interesting. That really seems to matter. So those that are more environmentally kind of like engaged and think pesticides are not good, they are more likely to jump into the program. And that, of course, is also an entry point that is non-monetary. And there was a lot of path dependency. For example, if farmers were in conservation tillage programs where they also get direct payments, they are less likely to make that step, of course, because it's more difficult to substitute herbicides away. And then we are also looking at in more detail now is the exchange, the information exchange that really mattered a lot. So if you have neighbors that are also going in a program, or you have neighbors that are organic, that apparently was very helpful to get inspiration on how to do the pesticide-free production and also borrowing tools and so on. So overall, what we observe is that large-scale transition to pesticide-free production is possible, but I would say probably only in Switzerland for now, because this is an interplay of policy, industry, where a lot of money is also flowing into the farms. And I think that interplay is really relevant, and also that there are farmers actually pushing and starting that. But also, even though money matters, more than money matters, so I think that fear about yield failures, yield risk, and also the perception of the environmental impact of pesticides that really was relevant. And we do additional analysis, and we also want to create a panel data. I said that we want to go back to these farms. We want to do choice experiments, so we want to stay with the case study a bit longer. So here is another breakpoint for questions, if there are some. And then comes the last block.
Are there any questions in the audience? Achim again.
Maybe I could also start here. What is the role of Migros in this development? You have a very special retailer situation with only two retailers, Coop and Migros, in Switzerland, and both, or you have some discounters as well during the last days, but these two traditional ones, and both are highly positioning their assortment towards sustainability. And this is very special. And is there a special role of Migros in this case, because they are a little bit under pressure, as far as I know, from because it's not so easy for them competing in price competition with at least Aldi, for example. No? Do they try to promote their sustainability program more and more? Are they concentrating on high-income households, or what is their strategy?
Yeah, thank you very much for that excellent question. So indeed, I mean, Coop and Migros are the biggest retailer. Denner is the largest discounter, but it's actually also owned by Migros. So, and Aldi and Lidl, and so they do not matter. I would say. So what matters is Migros and Coop, and Migros has this established relationship with IP Swiss, so they sell a lot of these products, not only like cereals, but and many other things like milk and meat and so on. And that producer association IP Swiss is about 24,000 out of the, or maybe 20,000 out of the 50,000 farms. So it's quite a big share of farms under that producer organization. So they have big established relationships, but then also Migros is massively pushing to lower also environmental footprints of their portfolio, especially if, I mean, also from the Swiss production. And that step here was, also feasible because Migros was not only concentrated at the retail market, but they also own, Migros and Coop own all the other things. They own all the mills and the bakeries. So basically, this is also Migros bakery that started with that thing, Jova it's called, that basically have that deal now to buy the wheat for higher prices. So I guess that kind of like a vertical integration to the full extent also enables to have very quick decisions here through the value chain. And Coop basically is pretty much focused on is not going to sell that necessarily, but they have organic production, and they push that they want to sell also only organic bread, for example, that comes in from Swiss organic produced wheat. So this is also a big thing. So that for that reason, I think in 10 years or so, because just if Coop and Migros want to meet their goals, they have in Switzerland, there is no conventional wheat production left, because this is either pesticide-free or organic, just to meet these demands. But this is, of course, also a product where you can easily, I mean, show that, and maybe it's also far easier to go pesticide-free than in many other products, right? This is also why they go there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Emmeline Top, who wants to ask her question herself. So please feel free to do so.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing the really interesting results. And I was surprised that, or I find it interesting that you found that farmers that were more environmentally engaged are more likely to enter this program, but also that if they do reduce tillage or conservation agriculture practices, then they're also less likely to enter the program. And I think that, yeah, this is like an interesting trade-off between different types of more environmentally beneficial farming. And There's some other research I've seen in the US which shows that conservation tillage or reduced tillage can be more of a bridge to wildlife-friendly farming. And I wondered if, yeah, you could just explain a little bit more about these findings.
Yes, thank you very much. I guess that's an important point, not taking the story of pesticides or conservation agriculture standalone, but always see this as a package, because this is ultimately the sustainability performance per kilogram of wheat that matters in a bigger picture. These actors involved in that market also did their life cycle assessment. That was positive for that step here, but I think ultimately there's no way you can basically harm conservation agriculture by not using pesticides. So this is also not a good story to tell to consumers. So there's a lot of research also going on kind of, for example, no-till or reduced-till practices. So, for example, FIBEL is the Organic Research Institute located in Switzerland, and they have fantastic research in that field. So I think this is something that needs to be needs to be achieved. But I also see your comment a bit in the line of like what farmers sought themselves in what programs. Probably we have a heavy selection bias, because the IP Swiss producers by definition are already more looking for environmentally friendly farming practices. So this is also an important point to expand that, also to see how others outside of the producer organization are attracted by specific programs.
Okay, thank you.
We have two other questions in the Q&A section, and the first one is from, I guess, Mr. Steinmann. Direct payments seem to be variable in Switzerland. How does it work to administrate different levels of these payments due to pesticide system? This seems different to Germany.
This is, thank you very much. This is, of course, an important point. You saw that at the numbers of the profit margin. So, of course, there's a lot of direct payment contributing to that. So direct payments are both huge in magnitude per hectare, but also large in complexity. I guess Switzerland has 104-105 different direct payment schemes, and they all come with different specifications below it. And sometimes, I guess, it's probably difficult to really control. And this is an important instrumental choice for the policies, agriculture policies. So I'm personally more convinced that result-oriented payments should play a bigger role, and not only the kind of like payment for specific measures. And especially, I mean, if it comes to using specific pesticides at a specific point of time, it's also difficult for me to understand how you can really control that. Maybe for wheat and having it pesticide-free, that is still feasible, but there are more complex specifications for other crops like sugar beets, where reduced pesticide use can also be just using it a bit, starting to use herbicides a bit later, and then you also get direct payments. This is, I mean, I guess an important trade-off here, and I'm personally convinced that also for that reason the no pesticide option is easier to handle. And there are challenges on the payment side, but of course there are also challenges along the value chain. I mean, that if you have a pesticide-free production channel, that also means you need organic, conventional, and pesticide-free. You need to have different pillars, and I mean, Switzerland is small, and this is very, very costly to establish different lines. So this, I see your point. This is very costly, and I also said that I guess outside of Switzerland that is maybe more difficult to implement. But looking, for example, to France and to INRAE and these research programs there under the Cultiver, Protéger Autrement, I mean, there's fantastic research going on in the direction of pesticide-free production systems, and maybe there are some elements that are also taken up in other countries. And I'm convinced that, for example, France is going to have much more on the table than Switzerland soon.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We have another question in the chat from Shuang Liu. Thank you for your interesting analysis. Is there a big market for the pesticide-free products in Switzerland? If the market is small, the price premium seems not sustainable.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think it's more like, I mean, Migros is not going to offer that as a choice to consumers, but it's basically saying this is our standard. And I think this is more, I guess Achim Spiller also indicated that this is also a bit of positioning in the market where you want to be seen as a sustainable actor, so to say. But yeah, I think if not in Switzerland, where can you sell these products? Switzerland is heavily relying on imports. 50% of the food is imported, but where this is possible, probably to have sustainable production schemes, you can also sell them here.
Thank you very much. And we have a third question here. Could pesticides be linked to climate policy of agriculture?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess it's also related to the conservation agriculture aspect. So, I mean, if you then start heavy tillage and you have more emissions, then this is backfiring. And I think, yeah, that shouldn't be the case, but it's probably more complex than that, the interplay between pesticides and climate policies. But this is an important point. It was also mentioned, if there are goal conflicts, trade-offs, then this, of course, is an important area. Not to say, well, we can't go further because there are goal conflicts, but rather than to look for solutions. And I think this is this is a scientific challenge, but also for policy and industry, of course, to avoid it. Yeah, that's an important point.
And another question just popped in from Katrin Pape. Thanks for this interesting presentation. You touched briefly on the role of all actors in the food system. What about the role of the agrochemical industry? Do you see changes happening there, alternative products or services being offered?
Now I first have to look in the list of participants who is there and what I can say. No, I guess agrochemical industry has multiple layers in Switzerland. You're well aware that Syngenta is Switzerland based. So of course they also were campaigning in that on these votes of the popular initiatives. They put a lot of money in that as well. It's clear for which side. But on the other hand, we also see that, for example, FENACO, the agricultural input supplier in Switzerland, they also, of course, they sell a lot of pesticides. It's part of their business, but they also start renting out weeding robots to farmers and look into ways you can make money with more sustainable agriculture. So, I mean, this ultimately, if there is something to be gained, probably they also go into that direction, but probably it's fair to say that companies now relying on selling agrochemicals are probably not on the forefront of moving into low pesticide production systems. But I think if for example, that example with the FENACO, if the company making most of the extension to farms and selling all the inputs and equipment, if they don't, I mean, if they make a move, then of course it also moves the entire sector very quickly. So again, I think this is an important element to if you don't have these companies on board, then it's very difficult to make big steps. So it's always also a bit personally torn where to place them, but they play an important role. Yeah, but if there are opportunities, also economic opportunities upstream, then they also will act, but maybe not as quickly as we would.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Xiao Yu, who wants to ask a question. So, in person. So, Denise, could you unmute him, please?
Okay. Thank you. Robert, thank you very much for your nice presentation. So I just ask one question. So that's just anything related with the climate policy. But the second thing, I don't know if in Switzerland are there any like a biocontrol industry, like in China. There's some there's some industries, particularly for this as a future substitute for pesticides, like some specific pests, like in English, I don't know, that is many minutum could control for some pests. I don't know if there are any research or any progress or any industry in Switzerland.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an excellent point, because now, yeah, indeed, we talked about agrochemical companies, but of course there are also others. For example, Andermatt Biocontrol is an important player in Switzerland, but they also are active internationally. And of course, this is key, that there are actors providing solutions. But I think I just come back to that example with the FENACO, the biggest input supplier. They of course also have biological pest control in their portfolio, and they also make money with that. But this is clearly important, to also have these alternatives available. I mean, this is the point. If you take away farmers' pesticides, whether you do that on a voluntary basis or you forbid it, as it was proposed, you also have to have alternatives on the table, and they have to be viable, technically feasible, and implementable, but then also have to pay off in the end, right? And not bring farmers into big trouble and risk. So in that sense, if there's a clear need for alternatives, and this is one important point as you indicate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for answering these questions. I think we move on with the presentation, because there are much interesting things waiting for us, and we have more time for discussion than afterwards.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. The next case study is basically, this is wine. So probably most of you don't associate Switzerland with wine, but from all the plant-based products sold from Swiss agriculture, the share of wine is 17%. So all non-animal products, the rest is 17% is wine. So this is economically very important. Because there's a relatively large share of wine in Switzerland. B, because it's also sold to very high prices. And beyond that economic value, there's important cultural value in Swiss agriculture from that wine production. For example, this year is the Lavaux. This is UNESCO World Heritage, and this is the Lac Le Mans, so close to Lausanne. And this is an important component of Swiss landscape and agriculture. But on the other hand, of course, wine is also very pesticide intensive. So of course, it depends on the production systems, but you have about like 16 applications of pesticides in Switzerland, and vast majority of it is fungicides. So also here is an entry point to basically reduce pesticide use a lot at the intensive margin, but also there's a big share of land under grape vines in Switzerland. And also here, we talked about IP Swiss. So this is also something where the Migros then, via its retailer Denner, Migros is not selling alcohol, but they have to do that via Denner. They initiate a low pesticide wine label and want to be big here in future. So goals of reaching 25% of the market with a 50% reduced pesticide reduced wine. And the only way I would say you can go there is by having varieties that use are allowed to reduce fungicide use massively. And these are fungi-resistant varieties, or PV wines. And this needs to be much more widely used in future in order to reach these low pesticide goals. Again, from a policy point of view, these 50% reductions that you want to have, soon, but also these industry goals as indicated here in that relationship. So I said most of these things. Maybe Swiss wine market, you may have experienced that you don't find Swiss wines in your German supermarket, not because there are no wines and they are not good, but this is a highly domestic centered market, and there's a lot of small scale direct marketing and an additional like 50% for marketing via the retail. And I said that kind of like fungi resistant varieties can play a vital role, and they cannot perfectly substitute away fungicide application in the Swiss environment, but reduce it by about 80%. But they are rarely used, and we have started with a paper, but also here have follow-up activities actually to be initiated soonish. And in that first paper, we looked at the adoption of these resistant varieties, because this is an important leverage to reduce pesticide use, and again, making something that is economically attractive also for producers, and wanted to look at the interplay with marketing channels. So this is the point, that this is not, again, independent of the downstream process. So what we did is we used survey data, again, from about like 700 producers of grape wines in Switzerland. This is covering a large share of the wine production. You see here with these dots where wine production in Switzerland is taking place, so almost everywhere. And then you see here also a bit the distribution of fungi-resistant grapes at the level of the farms. You see 20% of all the surveyed producers have fungi-resistant varieties, but if you look on the average acreage covered with these varieties, it's a bit more than 1%. But then if you take the average across all farms, it's 7%. So just farm level average, and then but there are strong regional differences that is also associated with culture. It's associated likely also with geographical indications. So, for example, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, this is more likely to be used, fungi-resistant varieties, compared, for example, to the nice picture of the Lavaux. There, this is not very common. And looking at the marketing channels that producers use, because we also surveyed that, 50% mainly market grapes, but then 50% mainly their own wine. So they sell their wine to consumers or to gastronomy or in other channels, but they do that themselves. And direct marketing along these lines is also very relevant for 40% of the producers. Very relevant means more than 50% of their wine is going via direct marketing. And what we see is that adopters are more likely to market wine and not the grapes. So if you market the grapes, you are less likely an adopter of resistant varieties, and also that direct marketing is very much associated with the use of resistant varieties. And that's actually also, here we did talk with producers, and this is pretty much also reflecting their experience sometimes, that this is an important point, but I will come back to that. And then some other descriptors. These adopters are younger, have more revenues from wine, and are more likely organic. So this is maybe something I forgot to say. Organic production in wine and using organic fungicides is probably as bad as using conventional fungicides. So this is not a switch to organic that solves the problem, but it's really a reduction of fungicide use that is needed. And of course, the share of resistant varieties in organic production is higher, but it's also not super high. So in that sense, this is a challenge that goes beyond the adoption of organic. And then the farm size picture, because I wanted to come back to that challenge of the overall series. So it's a bit puzzling here, and that was interesting to look into it. So larger farms overall are more likely to adopt it. There's also like the notion of trying out, having some parcels under new varieties. Also, of course, the turnover is very slow with wines and grapes. But then if we look deeper into it, we see, okay, smaller farms usually, if they adopt, then they have a higher share of resistant varieties. And especially very small farms, sometimes if they adopt, then they also have a very high share. So this is a bit complex table, but this is the main story. So it's a mixed picture, but there are some very small farms that really are producers that go almost only in resistant varieties, and there are very big farms that try out with resistant varieties. And the truth, whether small or big is better, somewhere in between then again, as always. And then here we also try to explore the association between the uptake of these varieties and the marketing channels. So particularly interested on that relationship. We, of course, have several control variables, and this is also very specific again, as before. Here, for example, we have a very nice indicator for fungi pressure, and of course also weather and so on. We account for the probably not random allocation of the direct marketing structures, or the general marketing structures, use inverse probability weighting, and here even account then for the proximity to urban areas and so on, and many things. And overall, what we find is very strong and very clear. If you market grapes, this is associated with a smaller probability of taking up fungi-resistant varieties. But then if you market your wine and the direct marketing, this is associated with higher uptake. So overall, the closer you are to the consumer, the more likely you are going into resistant varieties. And this is also the same if we take not yes and no, but also the share of resistant varieties, the number of resistant varieties. So we have many robustness checks around that. And also the sample splits and basically find a very clear picture in that respect. And so I said that already, so this is an important point. I think the more distant the producer is from the consumer, the less likely she is going to adopt these varieties. And that's a bit, I mean, we have currently a master student who's also a wine producer. She said, well, yeah, the consumers were asking, what are you doing about pesticides? And then they start to plant some varieties. Said, like, look outside, we have planted new varieties. So sometimes it's that kind of like addressing consumer needs, but then also the perception is that communication of something that is you are not used to drink, it's a different variety, it tastes different, it sometimes is easier to communicate in a more direct setting. So in that setting, maybe it's a bit exaggerated, but then here in that setting, the shorter supply chain can facilitate also a transition via that communication channel, transition to low pesticide wine production. So what that means is, probably from a policy point of view, you need something concerted and coherent. So breeding new varieties is definitely key, providing them to farmers and reliable and good alternatives to the current varieties, but you also need the market around that. And that creation of a market, and again, it's very specific to Switzerland, because I said that with the market is very much related on Swiss consumers and a lot of small-scaled kind of like also marketing activities. But here that, of course, offers some opportunities, because something like shorter supply chains, direct marketing also has a component to diversify farms. So in the context of risk management, that might be viable, but you also can create new income sources, and it can go hand in hand with sustainable agriculture practices. So this might be something interesting. But this is not everything. So new technologies are important as well. I just want to say that, and of course also consumers have to accept new varieties, but also new technologies that are in the vineyard. For example, that application of pesticide using drones is also very important in Switzerland now, substituting partly also helicopters. Also maybe more sustainable. And I said it a couple of times, we have multiple research projects ongoing in these and related fields. One of these projects is a bigger project with many other partners called Trapigo, Transformation in Pesticide Governments. But we really want to work on these case studies, but also others, like here the fruit production is of course another area of interest, where we want to kind of really research how that transition, because if Switzerland is trying to meet these targets from policy and industry, then something has to happen, and that research, we hope at least, can support a bit that how it's happening and that this is happening in an efficient way. So to conclude, and then I'm done. Yeah, so started a bit with that bigger problem that we have to, whether we want or not, reduce pesticide risk. This is a policy goal, but that shouldn't kind of go on the expense of food production. And to do that, to reach that, you need, I think, like a holistic perspective. So more than the farm level is needed, but also probably more than just banning and command and control, but it needs a package. Haven't talked a lot about extension and so on, but this is, we also have papers on that this is key. Here, I said that a couple of times, I think up and downstream activities are crucial. I think in general, not only related to the Swiss market, but that needs to be part of the solution. And there are, on the other side, really opportunities for holistic and coherent policy packages. I said that with the farm size is ambiguous. The relevance here for the pesticide story, small and big farms can reduce pesticide use, but I think an important component comes really with, if we talk about investments, and then it's not maybe the question to stop there and say, well, small farms can't invest in new technologies. So for that reason, small farms are not viable candidates to make the transition, but in contrast, probably it's rather framing the question differently and ask, like, what forms of collaboration and cooperation can be there, and what role can also policy play here to enable them to tap on that. For example, service providers are becoming much more relevant in Switzerland, also in the field of plant protection. So there is going to be a big change in the structure, but not necessarily in the farm size. And I think a lot of these case studies are very Swiss specific, and of course overall optimal policy packages are really very much dependent on the specific agriculture and food systems and farm structures. So that's very difficult to generalize here, but nevertheless opportunities to also learn from other examples. And then last but not least, I said that, I mean, if Switzerland is trying to come even a bit close to the ambitious goals, then must be by definition then a role model in terms of bringing things to the ground and being a role model also in terms of innovation of pesticide use reduction. And I had 2 weeks ago, I had a presentation in front of the Swiss Cereal Producer Association, and I ended with, like, where, if not in Switzerland, something like that shall happen, because there's an unbelievable support of taxpayers to pump money into that system, and consumers are paying a lot for more sustainable products. So if not here, where else? With that, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. That was really interesting, looking at these two different case studies with two very different products. So what questions are there from the audience? I can see, okay, we have a question from Erika Angarita.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I have a question about how easy or how difficult, let me reframe the question. Normally you present that some data, some traditional data like farm size or age or education level are not really correlated or is not precise, right? In this process of this case study, which other, let's say, topics or issues do you find that could be the next step to investigate more in detail? Maybe some trends or some other ideas for next type of research, not so much focusing the size of the farm or the age of the farmers and so on. So more that, what could be the highlights for next type of socio-economical research in terms of adoption or transition towards a new system or so on. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I think the Yeah, there are multiple points, of course. But the one example that we had also with wine and other fruits is the role of extension. That is very interesting. We had a paper that was also in food policy earlier this year, looking at the influence of public vis-a-vis private extension on pest management decisions, and I mean it's what we expect, but it's very rare research documenting it. The public extension service has made it is associated more with, let's say, preventive measures taken up by farmers and less reliance on insecticides. It was a very specific example on Drosophila suzuki, an invasive species. So this I think is an important area, not only I mean whether information is there, but also how and whether it actually reaches the farmers. In our project, the Strapico project, the entire project is centered around the role of evidence and the role of evidence in the policy process and in kind of like the industry decisions, but then also at the level of the farm. So we really also want to explore what type of evidence is actually efficient in changing farmers' behavior, and also what could be good entry points to nudge in that sense also farmers, because I said that earlier with the wheat, for example, we really saw the huge uncertainty, the huge heterogeneity in expectations. And I think here we learned, and we also, because we did that together with the Farmer Association, really also had that exchange that showing farmers results of trials and showing them the yield reductions are not 50% if not using herbicides, are of course easy fixes to bring farmers into that. And the same is, of course, if you have evidence about for example, the toxicity of products that you use, or the environmental performance overall, that may also trigger them into specific production lines. So this is something that we proceed. There are many entry points to work in that field. Yeah.
We have another question from the Q&A section. A little question, I think it's a methodological question, a little question about the estimation model. Have you calculated the correctly predicted ratio for the table which estimates the FRG adoption? The R-square seems really small. I'm curious if the estimation has the good fitness of the data.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed. This is a fair point. The R-square in that estimation is indeed well of about like 10%, I mean this is probably like an empirical question ultimately, but I personally feel it's not it's not too bad given the large heterogeneity that is there. But the important point is, do we miss the most crucial variables likely, right? And this of course, we try to address that by adding more and more sophisticated controls like that fungi pressure. I said that earlier. We also use these Oster bounds to explore a bit like what relevance should other kind of like unobserved and not considered variable, what role do they have to play in comparison to the controls that we use in order to remove these effects that we find at the relation between uptake of resistant varieties and the marketing channels. And basically what we find here is that these Oster bounds indicate that we would need really important variables that we missed here in order to make that breakdown. So this is this is a good indication that we are at least on that relationship between uptake of fungi-resistant varieties and marketing channels are on the safer side. But of course, what we don't have is like a let's say we have little ability here to come to causal relationships, so to say. So, and this is something where we also are looking forward to create a bit these panel data sets based on our own surveys, basically going back. And that, of course, might not solve everything, but at least contribute. But I think this is for that reason also very important. Yeah, so that's maybe that. And regarding the estimation, so I mean, I guess we started with OLS and then also had all the other things like that are more appropriate for binary data included. And I said that we also tried to reformulate the dependent variable and not only saying yes and no, but also how much in terms of share, how much in terms of varieties. And basically we all the time find the same relationship between these marketing channels. That the closer you are to the consumer, the more likely you are in taking up these varieties.
We have another question. Could be the fungi resistance variety compulsory in Switzerland? Just a hypothesis, any institution barrier or cost issue?
A wonderful question. Thank you very much. But maybe you could say this is mandatory. But it's actually probably even the other way around in the moment, because there is a relationship between geographical indications like these AOPs. No, I'm not sure what it is in that setting. But basically, if you have a wine from the Lake of Zurich and it's on the bottle, then it also comes with some kind of regulations on the production. And in some parts of Switzerland, this is totally open, like at the Lake of Zurich. There is no kind of like restriction which varieties to use, but in other cantons that are more traditional in terms of traditionally focused on specific varieties, then this is an issue. So rather, I think producing under some geographical indications currently means that you have difficulties in switching into these varieties and marketing them in these. And because this is done on the cantonal level, and as you saw on the map, many cantons in Switzerland have wine. We basically also have, we have a list on what is used where, but we have to also see how dynamic these lists are over time, so where the cantons just react. And I think this is an important policy point, maybe not making it mandatory, but making things open for resistant varieties is already like a very important step towards more sustainable production. But and this is again linked to the marketing channels. So because in some parts, if they just, in Ticino, if they just sell Merlot and you don't deliver Merlot, then there's nothing to sell. This is very easy or not easy then for the producer. But this again depends a bit on which channel you operate in. So if you do direct marketing, of course, you're not heavily relying on too many labels, but yeah, you can do your own things. So this is an interesting point. But making things mandatory, new varieties, I'm not sure whether this is going to sustain. Also because there's a huge variety in terms of like what wines are produced where in Switzerland. So this is not the same variety dominating in each canton or region, so to say. So in that sense, if this variety is lost, then also part of that cultural value probably is lost. So yeah, but a good question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this is very specific for wine, I guess. Achim has another question.
Yeah, I also like to go on with this topic of Charalue. In Germany, wine marketing is even more focused on varieties. Take the example of Riesling, which German wine is very proud of his Riesling. So we have a variety, and all the marketing efforts are put in this variety marketing. And so we have this PV new varieties, but nobody knows the names. So should or what type of government could we use in this case? Because could it be allowed to put more PV wine into traditional varieties? So I think in the moment we have something like some percent are allowed to mix, and could we level this up so that you could put in 25 or 30% of this PV variety into a Riesling, for example? Or what type of governments do you have in mind, especially for our German market?
Good question. Good question. So yeah, maybe this is something. This is the regulation, so to say. And now I had the geographical indication, and I'm not so sure how you do that with the. I mean, if it's a specific variety on the bottle, then it should be probably that variety in the bottle. So maybe there is little room to operate there. But at the geographical indications, as I said, that probably this might be something that you also can reach the highest levels, so to say, of quality labels ultimately, which they are also, because here the geographical indications are not only associated with, I mean, this is a wine from the Lake of Zurich, but it also means that, for example, the harvested quantity per whatever square meter is substantially lower than on the other kind of specifications of the production system. So, and allowing resistant varieties to be part of it, that's probably already one point. The other thing is, yeah, you have other varieties that taste different, and I mean, there are good and bad traditional and PV wines. So I don't know. I mean, personally, I have to try that out further where the pattern is for me, but ultimately, it's also a point of making things more visible. And for example, I mean, it's very difficult from a policy point of view. Should the policy be on marketing wine, alcohol? I'm not so sure. But for example, in Switzerland, a lot of money is put also in the advertisement or for meat and milk and eggs. So this is only paid by taxpayers. And I personally think then instead of putting meat in the window and paying the big advertisement for meat, it's maybe then better to have also a campaign here. But maybe again, it's really a thin line of where to put it. But ultimately, if nobody knows and nobody knows the advantages and disadvantages from the producer to the kind of like the retailers, for example, and then to the consumers, this is difficult. But now again, I started with that slide with IP Swiss and Denner/Migros making the deal. So if they can make that fly, then of course this is the vehicle. If they say we want to reach that, and that's the only way we can reach it, then this is going to be interesting. I would say just this one point.
Okay, there is another question from Mr. Steinmann, probably.
Yeah, that's Mr. Steinmann. Steinmann, yeah. You can hear me, yeah. So my question is, if we talk about pesticide and pesticide reduction, especially if we talk in Germany, we sooner or later come to the point that a reduced pesticide availability or lowering pesticide intensity will bring farmers to stop their business, to go out of business, and will accelerate Strukturwandel, structural change, as we say. So from your investigations in Switzerland, what do you say? What is your guess? Will reducing pesticides, will that bring farmers out of business, so will boost structural change, or will it be help to keep farmers in business? And if you say the last is true, is this also true for the German discussion? What is your position to Strukturwandel?
Yeah, you phrased the question in a way that I can only lose here. No, I definitely see the point. I mean, I mean, we have these policy goals, right? And they don't go away. I mean, this 50% reduction that is written down in all national action plans in the farm to fork, again, and just reiterating goals. And I think from an overall perspective, reducing pesticide risk for the environment and human health is I mean, this is no question that we have to go that way. But I said it a couple of times, without harming production of food, without harming provision of other ecosystems, services, without harming the farms, without harming consumers. And I mean, this is an eierlegende Wollmilchsau, so we probably never reached that, but we need to articulate these goals. So taking just that out of context and say, well, if we reduce pesticides, then we are all going to die, and all farms are going to die, this is maybe a bit exaggerating. I think it's important to have a clear goal, but also a clear way how to go there. And I mean, I said it a couple of times, it's really not, obviously not easy to reduce pesticide use in all farming systems. And maybe it's also not the way forward to reduce pesticide use in all farming systems, but there might be some opportunities where something can be contributed to reach these 50%, and then you should go that way. I think an important element is also the time component. So in these popular initiatives that I talked about, for example, they have foreseen an 8 or 10-year respectively time of transitioning. This was perceived as too short from the industry, like from the farming sector. So, I mean, ultimately, it's often also a wrong question, and asking removing 50% of pesticides tomorrow is obviously totally weird, and that will come with big consequences. But if you remove 50% of pesticides in 10 or in 15 years, it's maybe less of a consequence because you can also adjust. So in that sense, I mean, it's a difficult question. So I wouldn't say that. I mean, we just have environmental goals, and I just can say that again. They won't go away. But with respect to structural change, I think this is an important element also regarding the alternatives to be used, and which technologies can sustain at what level, and also what kind of economic opportunities arise from specific production systems. And I'm fully aware that the Swiss system is, of course, like a luxury good that you produce domestically and you can market for high prices, and you can't do that in all parts of the world, and Europe and Germany. This is very clear. So there won't be probably the market to have only pesticide-free wheat production in Germany. So that's, I'm fully aware this is not a way forward to be copied to other systems fully. But there may niches emerge, but on the large scale, probably it's really more a reduction, not removing something. I don't know whether I came close to addressing your question, but I tried to. So I think it's not so easy to say it's either or. It depends a lot on the crop, on the system. So
Yeah, thank you. It is, as you said, it's not that easy. So thank you for your for trying to give an answer. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so currently I don't see any further questions, but our time is also coming to an end. So I think maybe this is a good point to stop the discussion here. And I would like to thank you very much for your time, Professor Finger, and for your presentation, for answering all questions, and for sharing your position on this topic with us. And of course, I also would like to thank the audience for joining our seminar series and for participating in the discussion, and of course also to those who just came to listen to the presentation. And I want to highlight our next presentation on the next Tuesday, which will be again in German language. And there we have Professor Ute Knierim from the University of Kassel, and she will talk about the relationship between animal welfare and farm sizes, and about complexities in this picture. So again, a very interesting topic, I think. But for today, Professor Finger, our thanks is on your side. Thank you very much for giving the presentation and joining our seminar in Göttingen.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity to present here. Let me phrase it that way, and also big thanks for the lot of questions and hints. So it's very